Okay, so those at home, can you see the screen okay?
Yes.
Or where we're at. Okay, cool. All right, so let's continue talking about behavior. So we were talking about how behavioral ecology is an area of animal behavior or biology, obviously, where they look at how does that behavior important for being an adaptation for survival in their environment? How does it increase their fitness? So again, it's from an evolutionary point of view, which is like, for instance, why would a bird bother to remove eggs from a shell? Why would goslings bother to imprint? Well, it obviously increases their survival if they follow their mother. Birds that don't follow their mother are going to probably get eaten pretty quickly or not find food or lose it, you know what I'm saying? So that's the adaptation. And look at try to figure out the fitness, what makes it, because again, birds that imprint on their mother or birds that have the egg rolling behavior pass on those genes that helped shape the brain that do that behavior. So ecologist, it starts getting into gray areas when you start talking about animal behavior, and then you get into ecology and some of these other things. Like foraging behavior is very much an ecological thing that people study. How does, the amount of time you spend trying to graze and eat or whatever, there's an optimal amount of time for foraging and trying to avoid predators or finding a new food source. So those are all these kind of things that are taken into consideration by biologists that are studying animal behavior. So they try to put everything into kind of this pros and cons and efficiency. Ecologists try to put all that into it. And then they make models. Here's some of the ideas that have come out of animal behavior and ecology. This one's pretty obvious. Territoriality this is the behavior in which individual members of a species maintain exclusive use of an area. So there could be situations where a bird guards a certain territory. We can see this all the time with red-winged blackbirds. They'll guard a little area around the pond, and then they'll chase off potential competitors and hopes to bring a female into their mating area. So if they get a better area near the pond, they're probably more likely to have a higher mating percentage than the red-winged blackbird that got pushed out to the road somewhere, and his nest is by the roadside. So territoriality is an example of this. Some birds increase their nectar availability by defending their particular flowers. So they're not going to allow other individuals of the same species to come in and take their nectar source. And then this male bird is probably going to have a female that wants that nectar source too, and he's more likely to have a higher mating percentage likelihood or probability. And then their offspring are going to have a higher probability of survival. So there's a reason for this territoriality that's being seen. And so thus this behavior of guarding this nectar source is favored by natural selection because it increases the fitness of their offspring. Another thing that we see in birds and a lot of animals is migratory behavior, right? In the seasons when it gets too cold, we see a lot of birds go from north down to south. And in the case of the northern hemisphere, anyway, I guess it'd be the opposite in the southern hemisphere. or obviously it could be. So once things in daylight increases, birds that flew south for the winter are going to start flying back north, and we're already seeing that up here in the springtime. The eagles are starting to fly north. We're seeing a lot more vultures again. Vultures tend to fly south during the winter. Now I'm seeing vultures around again. And so these are all examples of birds, and so we've all seen this migratory behavior every season. Well, and so you'll see big groups of birds flying, south during the winter, and now we're seeing them flying north in big groups, and then they'll spread out and find them their little territories and whatever. So people study this, and then they try to figure out, well, how does a bird know which direction to go? And some of it's going to be based on the way they see the world. So they can see polarized light. Some birds can see polarized light. Some birds are going to have map senses. They can actually develop a mapping. So they can keep track of where things were. So they develop a mental map. They can see landmarks, and they study those. I guess you could say. I don't know if they said they're thinking about it, but it definitely imprints on their brain in some manner. Some have compass sense, so they'll have, I think there's some little, I can't be for certain, but I remember hearing something that's like, it can be little stones that maybe are some type of organ that helps them to orientate to magnetic poles of the earth. Or they can see UV lights and polarized lights and all sorts of things that help them to direct them as a compass. So a lot of weird things like that do exist, apparently. So experiments on starlings indicated that inexperienced birds migrate with an innate compass sense. And I think it's due to these structures in their brain and things like that. But once they have the basic direction down, they learn as well by finding landmarks as they fly. Maybe it'll be a mountainside or a river or something like that. So example, they're showing starlings learn how to navigate. So if they transport captured birds and bring them down to Switzerland, flight of experienced birds will go back to the direction they came from, apparently. Well, inexperienced birds will fly down to Spain or something like that. So apparently learning is involved in this. How is this compass sense achieved? Again, they're going to be able to orientate to the sun and the stars. But there are also examples of migratory birds detecting the Earth's magnetic field. And again, I think there's due to there's a little bit of minerals or something in their brain or in certain areas that function to help pull. Just like in our ears, we have little stones that help us to orientate up and down. We have little stones that are sitting on gelatin, right? And then they bend the hair cells that then send signals down your nerves. You guys remember that from physiology class? So again, you might have one that's, you can pick up on magnets a little bit. But again, they also have the ability to form maps by looking at mountains and coastlines, and so they can get an idea of directions. But how they get through featureless terrain is more of a puzzle. They're not quite certain how they do that. But I'm not sure, maybe not everything's featureless, I don't know. They also, biologists love to study reproductive behaviors. If you take in one of Dr. Pierce's class, I'm sure you'll learn about sexual selection, or it'll at least be mentioned, hopefully, in a zoology class. Sexual selection is was probably better explained as an example, where it seems like females tend to be a little more choosy when it comes to mates. They spend a lot more energy on reproduction. Eggs are big and energetically expensive. in comparison to sperm. Females have to carry their eggs, right? Or they have to carry their young. Nursing, there's a lot of energy involved. So it appears that females do more of this selectional selection, and there'll be traits that are found in males that they're selecting. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen both ways to some degree, but it seems to be the females are more choosy. And we can see this really prominently in birds. Birds, for instance, have very colorful, males tend to be very colorful. Females tend to be a little bit more camouflaged or drab. Have you ever noticed that? So those colorful appearances to the male bird, it's again, this is putting it into a kind of a human explanation. Basically, tell the female, hey, I got it going on. It's like the guy that can own a Corvette and pay his bills still, or whatever fancy cars out there nowadays. That's a sign to female, even female maybe, I don't know, or they have a good career or something, high social status. Well, for birds, if you're colorful and you haven't been eaten, because if you have a colorful appearance, you're much more likely to get eaten, right? It's telling the female, I can, provide territoriality, and I can keep my colors. So that means I must be eating well. So I must have some genes. Again, this is putting in a human way of saying it. I don't think the females are necessarily sitting there thinking about all that. But that's the idea, is that the females tend to be choosing the more colorful birds, while the females are being camouflaged. That's good to hide from predators. So anyway, that's sexual selection. So intrasexual selection, competition between members of one sex. So intrasexual selection would be examples of like male deer competing with one another, hitting each other. And if they can do that, they might have a few more mate selections than one that loses. That's intrasexual selection. And then intersexual selection is mate choice, where females are doing the choosing. But it may be a combination of all these things. Here's an example of evidence for mate selection and sexual selection. So the first one, we're going to skip down here and we'll go back up to the deers. Intersexual selection, again, is due to ornamentation, ornamental structures. So in the case of this, what do we call these birds again? Peacock. Peacock, good, thank you. Peacocks, they found that if they have a lot of eye spots, the number of mates they have is much higher. So if you take out more eye spots, they have less mating opportunities. So there is a correlation to eye spots to mating opportunities. So females prefer males with lots of eye spots. That's intersexual selection, sexual selection. That's how I always thought of it. Just intrasexual selection, again, is where the deer have antlers and kind of beat each other up a little bit, and then that increases their mating opportunities by pushing out less successful deer. So if they got, obviously you can see it a little more complicated in the deer fields, but you'll see males chasing females until they just can't stand it anymore. Anybody go hunting, you'll see that all the time during the rut. But they usually, before the rut, they're kind of competing with each other, and that definitely increases their likelihood. When these competitions take place, the successful male tends to, get a little bit of a testosterone boost or something like that, that makes them feel like a winner. The loser tends to have a little bit of reduction in testosterone or some other hormones that make them aggressive. And so they're less likely to go after the next male at that season, or after females as much. And they can see this, in lobsters and all sorts of animals. The benefits of mate choice for females: the male that provides the best offspring care. So if a male can protect the territory, that would be considered a good thing. They have resources. And it might suggest that, again, I don't like these words completely, best genes, but these are things that I guess they're being used to explain why a female would choose a peacock with more eyes, because this peacock basically has a big signal that says eat me, and he hasn't been eating. So that means the females that this bird's got it going on. He's going to be able to send your kids to college. Not to put in the sexist term, right? But that's kind of what we're getting at a little bit. Again, it depends on the animal species, but there's all sorts of different mating systems, from monogamy, polygyny, which is one male and many females, and polyandry, which is one female and many males. This one's a little bit more rare. You don't see this as much. You'll see these more. And in humans, we would probably call it serial monogamy. I don't think many people end up just with the one mate for the rest of their life, do they? Is that what's happening when I look around the world? You met your girlfriend in high school, and you never dated anybody ever again. Is that would you say that's true, or is that just rare cases nowadays? Especially now with this, right? Now I'm starting to think polygyny and polyandry is probably happening because of that. The whole mating thing in humans have changed, I think, since I was a kid anyway. See, animal reproductive strategy involves decisions regarding the following: choices of mates, number of mates, the time and energy devoted to rearing offspring. So I think choosier mothers, I guess you could say, again, these are all just putting it into simple human terms. It's more complex than this. If there's a lot more care needed for offspring, the females tend to be more choosy. That makes sense. And the less care that's needed, and you're going to put out thousands of eggs, probably the less choosy that species is. So if you're only going to have 2 or 3 kids, you're going to probably be a little more choosy in theory. Yeah, as I've already said this. The other, again, is it tends to be, when there is choosy animals, the females tend to exercise more mate choice than males. And that sounds a little sexist, I know, but I think it's probably correct. What about social communication? There's all sorts of chemical cues that animals can use for the signal to each other. We call these pheromones. In fish, for instance, little minnows have an alarm pheromone that can be learned and conditioned. So if you got minnows running around in your pond and a big bass bites one down, and the skin gets broken off, and there's an alarm pheromone called Schruckstoff that's released into the water. That Schruckstoff actually functions as an alarm pheromone that triggers the other minnows to go into an alarm behavior. They'll just start dashing all over the place and try to get out of the area. But at the same time, they learn to signal, basically kind of like classical conditioning. They trigger that alarm pheromone, triggers them learning that the bass is something they should avoid. So they learn. So the next time just the bass happens to be there, they're more likely to dart away, because they've learned to pick up the sight and the smell of the bass. But the first time it took their buddy to get eaten, and the alarm pheromone to be released. And we can see alarm pheromones in ants. If an ant nest gets disturbed, they're going to release alarm pheromone that triggers a lot of other ants to start running to the area. Or in bees, if a bee, especially in killer bees, if a bee stings and then the whole sting comes out, the alarm pheromones being released, it'll trigger the other bees in the area to start stinging. So that's an alarm pheromone. It triggers attacks. You can also see alarm calls, especially if you're used to walking in the woods. You can get a squirrel to start making an alarm call, right? But and I'm not talking about out here. I'm talking about if you actually go into the real woods. Around here, they'd probably be your pet if you wanted them to be. But squirrels in the woods, and they see, they're going to start making alarm calls, and that and other animals can pick up on it. Other squirrels can run off and stuff like that. Also, ants can form trail pheromones, where they can, so you can, they can actually make it, and so they can actually leave a trail that other ants will follow. You probably know this already, don't you? So they can actually leave trails. So if you ever have ants in your house, they'll make a trail. And so a guy named E.O. Wilson found this found these trail pheromones, could collect it, and he could make his own trail, and then the ants would follow it. You can write his name in it or something like that. So he found that the organs that were responsible for that. This one is really cool. I figured this would be out there with everybody knowing about it. Has everybody heard of the waggle dance in honeybees? Well, honeybees can go back to their hive and tell other honeybees approximately where the flower sources are. So there'll be a honeybee that's flown out, found a food source, they'll fly back to the nest, and then they'll perform a waggle dance, where they'll go around in this figure 8 shape, and then they'll waggle. And the number of times they waggle will give the approximate distance to the other bees watching it. And then the approximate direction that they're waggling will give them the approximate destination from the nest, like take a right. So they'll actually waggle in the basic direction to the flower source in the nest. And that'll be enough of a signal. And again, it's in relationship to the sun, apparently, that'll give them the basic compass direction, or I guess this case, that heading direction, whatever, from the sun to the flower source, and then the approximate distance based on the number of waggles it does. The guy that was very involved with this was Carl von Frisch, I was telling you about earlier. Some primates have a vocabulary that allows individuals to communicate the predatory identity. The vocalization of African or vervet monkeys, these are kind of just, they look like your standard monkeys, kind of a little bit light grayish color, as I remember. Anyway, apparently they make a different sound based on whether there's a leopard nearby or eagles nearby, because obviously these monkeys have to deal with both types of predators. So apparently if it's an eagle, they make this high frequency screeching sound that seems more intense. And then for leopards, apparently it's a different sound. Obviously it's hard for me to know what the sound, you kind of get an idea of what the sound might be like by looking at this frequency per second, but it might be something that'd be easier to hear on YouTube or something like that, as you can imagine. But anyway, apparently they can make different sounds, and that's good, right? Because if it's an eagle, you may want to hide in a different place than what if it's a leopard. Leopards, you may want to be a little, maybe it's a different kind of thing. Obviously, eagles, you definitely don't want to be out in the open. I'm not sure you want to be in the open with a leopard either, but at least you're not looking. You don't want to be looking up for the eagle when the leopard's coming by. So that's at least that's one thing we know for sure. We need to make sure that we can get an idea which way to go. As I mentioned before, humans also have the ability to instinctively look at consonants. There's around 40 consonants and around 3,000 human languages. And so humans have the ability to pick up on those consonants. And so if you're raised in a certain language and didn't hear those consonants, it's really hard for you to learn how to make those sounds later. There's different groups of people that have totally different consonants, and if you didn't grow up with it, it's hard for you to pick up on that with your ears or even make the sounds. I know there's some tribes in Africa that make kind of a clicking sound, right? The Bushmen. But anyway, that's true for all sorts of different languages, but that wouldn't be something that would come naturally to me, for instance, because I didn't grow up hearing those sounds. As you know, kids go through different stages where they'll have babbling, and then they'll begin to develop their vocabulary for 1,000 words or so, to form simple sentences and begin to learn the rules of grammar for their particular language. And then nonverbal communication is very critical too. We also learn that as well. But again, these are all developmental stages that are needed. And it's key that those stages happen when they're a child. If they don't get the proper exposure at a certain age, it's hard for them to catch up. I was talking to a friend whose kid had apparently kind of a chronic ear infection we couldn't hear. And it ended up that child actually had some language issues because it took about a year before they realized they needed tubes in his ears and things like that. So he's still kind of mumbling certain words. And so he's a little bit behind in language in comparison to his peers. So, anyway, so some of those things are examples that things have to happen at a certain age or they don't happen very well. Altruism is another kind of hotly studied area of interest historically. Why would some animal be willing to be altruistic? So is this meerkat being altruistic? Because if it's the guard for the other ones, it's more likely to be the one that's seen and eaten, possibly. Are you more likely to loan money to your family members before a complete stranger? Is it because you're genetically related to them? Those are the kind of questions. Are you more likely to be altruistic to someone that's genetically related to you? Thus increasing your own fitness because of the fact that some of your genes are in your siblings. Those are the kind of questions that biologists ask, that animal behaviorists ask. Again, natural selection tends to be focused on trying to increase your fitness of the individual versus the group, even though evolution takes place in populations. So altruistic behavior, though, may not be truly altruistic. Nest helpers may get parenting experience or inherit. So like, you see, I've seen chimpanzees where like an infant will help their mother raise their sibling, but it's also helping her become a better mother too. That may be an argument for that. Centials like that meerkat here may be able to escape the predators after they made their alarm call. So maybe he's helping the others by making the call while they're eating, but he might be the one that runs off first too. But he's also the one that might be picked up first. I guess you have to make the argument, but he's benefiting in some manner because maybe someone else will reciprocate and be involved in that, I guess you could say. So there's a reciprocal altruism that takes place. But if someone's a cheater, usually that's a behavior that will be selected against. We don't like cheaters, right? So if you're going to, you're going to do the dishes, you're hoping your roommate's going to do the dishes or reciprocate in some manner. Otherwise, are you going to continue being altruistic? I don't know. I'm kind of going a little bit off chart, but I'm trying to give examples from the real world perspective. So an altruist compensates for a reduction in its own reproductive success by increasing that of its relatives. That's what I was trying to get at with the money and loaning money. So you're more likely to loan money to somebody that's related to you, possibly. And so they're called as kin selection. So you're more the more closely related two individuals are, the greater the potential for the genetic payoff. So you're more likely to do a favor for your brother or your sister than you are for your cousin. You're more likely to do something for your cousin than a complete stranger, unless there's a reciprocal nature that's going on. So it says the white-fronted bee eaters, helpers tend to be close relatives. Helpers assist and increase their genetic relatedness. So it seems like this white-fronted bee eater helps individuals that are more closely related to it. So the probability of helping find, I guess, a honey source or whatever, if they're full siblings, they're much more likely to help each other than if they're half siblings or cousins or not related. You can also see this with male lions. Male lions that are siblings are much more likely to try to share the harem together and oust the previous males than lions that aren't related to each other, because they're sharing the genetics. So those two brothers, male lions, will try to take over pride, but then they're also sharing the genetics. So when their brothers mating, the offspring are also closely related to them. They're nephews and niece lions, right? So that's the example of kin selection. So it says social groups are usually less rigid and organized and cohesive than insect societies. So we're talking about social insects like termites, ant nests, beehives. So most, like a group of deer are going to be a little bit less organized when it comes to hierarchies. But in insect societies, there's a queen ant, there's drones, and then there's workers, and they might even be soldier ants. So they have a big hierarchy that's very organized, that's very genetically predetermined or due to the food and the genetics. So it's highly structured. But most vertebrates are not that structured. So here's like examples of, let's go look at termites, but I'm not seeing that right now. Let's see if there's anything else that's really. Vertebrates, I'm kind of skim some of this. However, vertebrate societies tend to display more conflict among members than insect societies. Let's see. Organization of societies is influenced by ecological factors such as food and predation. So African weaver birds, we've got the savanna dwelling birds build colonial nests, they have polygynous mating systems. So I'm not seeing much I need to tell you about, but obviously this is a social group of birds right here. Because apparently there's naked mole rats here as well. And there's a queen female mole rat. All right, so the last thing I want to tell you about this, and then we're going to, after our break, next 5-minute break, let's take look at a couple of videos on some of these behaviors, and then we'll call it a day. Does that sound pretty good? E.O. Wilson is an important name. I've actually met him a couple times. He was the person that was an entomologist. He worked at Harvard. And he was really well known for the field of creating the field of social biology. And in that field, a lot of it was looking at how social behavior in animals occurs. Some psychologists and sociologists didn't like it because it kind of felt like it was intrusion of this biologist into their field by using more evolutionary explanations. And there might be other reasons too. But a lot of what his ideas came out of watching what things like what the ants did, for instance, and seeing their high social structures. And then, anyway, I thought it was a very fascinating field. But anyway, that's an important name, and he has a lot of good work out there. But he's most famous for his studies on ants, in addition to the social biology. We might take a look at him too. So we're going to come back in 5-ish minutes. We're just going to look at a couple videos for 10 minutes on some of these behaviors, anything that might stand out, and then we'll call it a night. See you guys in 5 minutes. Please sign back on. I got to get a new upgrade to my system.